So I thought we'd start off here. You know, the theme of the event is Android at scale. And so, you know, we really get to look at what does it take to scale your team, scale your user base, and to really have big Android applications. But I thought we'd start out really and just kind of introduce our panelists and kind of run down the line here and get everybody to introduce themselves, your name, what you do, what you're passionate about, and what version of Android you started with. Let's see if we got anybody starting all the way back at Cupcake or before that. Android before it had a name. You know, what's your favorite dessert? So we'll start down here at the end. We've got Larry Schiefer, CTO of HiQ.
So I'm Larry Schiefer, CTO of HiQ. We're a mobile development company working throughout the software stack from bootloader all the way up through application. So I'm really passionate about embedded software and mobile software. As far as how far back Android, it would have been first public release of AOSP. So before we were naming things. That's when I first started working with Android.
So Android A. Excellent.
Hey everyone, my name is Ty Smith, and I work at Twitter on the Fabric team. Fabric is a modular SDK platform for mobile developers for iOS and Android, and we've been working on that product for about a year. I'm super passionate about the SDK space and about providing great value to other developers and developer tools in general. I started back on Android probably about 6 years ago, so I think that was 1.5. So, yeah.
Very cool.
Hi everyone. My name is Juan Gomez. I work at Eventbrite. We work on it. Eventbrite is a event marketplace. I work on the consumer apps, so the app that people use to find events on Eventbrite and buy tickets. I'm super passionate about Android. I started at about, I think my first app was Android 1.6, so that was Donut. So yeah, I've been at it for a little bit. Not as long as these guys, but for a little bit.
My name is Doug Bateman. I'm the training director and lead instructor at NewCircle, and I'm really passionate about improving the quality of the Android apps out there and really security and having people really take Android security seriously. And this is really my passion, and I started back on Honeycomb.
And my name is Howard Hart, and I work at Cyanogen and in the engineering group. And I've been working on Android since, actually, I guess before it got released, I was invited to Google's beta program to learn a little bit about it. And at that time, I was mostly working on Android from a hardware perspective. So I'm working my way up the stack and helping Cyanogen to scale Android onto more and more devices as we form new partnerships.
Hi everyone, my name is Jake Wharton. I work at Square, working on Square Cache specifically, as well as a few of our open source libraries. And I started Android on the M3 SDK for the Android Developer Challenge, because I was going to win that $250,000. But I never actually submitted an app, so.
Hi, I'm Mike Hines. I'm from Amazon, and I'm addicted to V1 projects. At Microsoft, I worked on about 3 or 4 V1s, scaled them up. Left Microsoft, did a startup, scaled that up, sold it to a company in India. Worked on V1 startups at Amazon. So version of Android, 3-ish, but really it started with Java ME Personal Edition. So really the hard way. The hard way.
Ouch.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Dave Smith. I work for Possible Mobile in Denver. We're a consulting organization, mostly in the sports and broadcasting space. And my first Android device was the ADP-1, which had 1.1 at the time, so that's Android B.
Very nice. Very cool. So I just looking at the format here, I thought we would start out with just pondering this question of what it means to be Android at scale. You can think of it as, you know, crossing the gamut of team structure, practices, testing, supporting customers. And so I just thought each of you guys might kind of say and give your take on where your passion is and interests when it comes to really talking about Android at scale. And just kind of go around and give your definition of where you look at Android and scaling.
Wow, that could mean a lot of different things.
It sure could. Just pick one.
All right, so I'll look at it from a team perspective because we often have to ramp up teams very quickly and grow our team very quickly as new projects come in, being a consulting firm. For us, it's very important to ramp up our teams. We usually pair somebody with a senior mentor on an existing project or even on an existing technology, have them sit with them, hand off any information. We might even have some training internal, and basically just try to get them slipstreamed into the development process as quickly as possible.
I think I'll talk about it from the device perspective. Our backend reports that we have billions of device installs. Providing a developer tool that's embedded in thousands of applications means that your code base lives almost on every device that is humanly possible to have. And that means that our backend sees, on average, trillions of requests from our analytics service.
For us, the advantage is we are at scale, but not as a scale as massive as some of these other companies. So we go behind and try to emulate some of the best practices and get the benefit of knowing things that have failed at bigger companies and then avoid those. And also trying to be, that's kind of how you scale without suffering as much as the guys that are in front of you. And then also trying to adopt new technologies to especially to give people the stuff they want where they want it. So now with Android Wear and some of the new possibilities on the Android platform, trying to be on the cutting edge so that you can offer people the things they want where they want them.
At Cyanogen, we've been focused historically on scaling through the plethora of devices that people want to run, the latest software on, and maybe the manufacturer doesn't support it. So it's been a huge community effort for people that are passionate about porting Android to new devices. And I think the goal of Cyanogen now is to work with the community to keep embracing that spirit, and at the same time come up with Cyanogen OS, which is something that's meaningful to grow into the new emerging markets.
So I guess at scale, to me, is really about how you can avoid the various grotesqueries that come with Android, which is not necessarily a bad thing since it comes with every platform, but really just getting things out of your way so you can actually focus on what the core value proposition of your product is, whether that's through libraries to solve common problems and patterns, to automation of things like testing and building and pushing out betas. Really just getting everything out of your way that prevents you from working on the core product that you're trying to ship.
So we're not going to let you off that easily. Give us the specifics.
Android has a lot of things that cause developers pain. And there are various third-party things which can smooth over the various rough edges that Android provides, allowing you to build the best app possible. Was that specific?
Very diplomatically and not naming things specific. All right, we'll let you off the hook and head down to Amazon.
So at scale, tech and processes that can be more productive or handle more throughput without falling over. I've not yet experienced growth at scale that is not painful at some point. Because your stakeholders or your investors, either they're not techie money people and they're asking, well, why can't this just work? Or they're really amazingly smart techie people with money, and they look at you and they say, why can't you make this work? So if you're doing everything right, nobody cares, nobody notices. But it's when you screw up that life becomes really, really painful. So at scale, it's just a story of pain, really.
I'm actually really surprised nobody stole my answer, and I'm glad. In the work that we do, one of the biggest things that an app will live and die by is its back end. And a beautifully designed, well-coded native application will fall flat on its face on launch day if the API and the back end doesn't scale. And I have seen, for very large broadcasting companies, a beautiful application get 1-star reviews on launch day because the API couldn't serve those requests after millions of dollars of television marketing for this campaign. So the app is not the only thing, and today an app is nothing without the back end that can drive it, and you have to make sure that can scale.
Absolutely.
Very cool. So I thought we would now kind of drill down into each of these different areas that we've been looking at. So let's start with features and just feature count. So we got some apps that you've got 50 developers all working on it with a whole host of different features that you've got to support. I think Cyanogen is probably fits in that space. Let's see here, Square, you've got quite a growing app, and of course Twitter Fabric. You guys are supporting all sorts of features that are built on top of Twitter Fabric. So who just out of the whole panel here, if anybody would like to kind of just chime in and talk about how do we manage teams that are managing this obscene number of features in the code base that comes with it? We could go to Amazon, for example, right? You've got Amazon Store that's got Amazon Instant Video and Amazon Kindle and all those things tightly integrated inside of it.
Yeah, I would rather start with the App Store that is available for the e-ink devices, built on Java ME Personal Edition. When you start something out in beta, you have a pretty clear and a pretty focused idea of what your solution looks like and what it is. When you get, hundreds of thousands, millions of more customers, I've never seen that happen without feature creep. So I've never seen getting to scale happen without that kind of feature creep. And figuring out what that feature creep means to your process, to your systems from a people level and training new staff level to a back-end level. Now all of a sudden you've got APIs that are being asked to do a whole bunch of different kinds of things. And one of the things we ended up with was on my startup company, we ended up with some data store conflicts because all of a sudden we were trying to access the same data element a whole bunch of times per millisecond. And of course, some of these requests are just going to drop out. And we were losing data, and we had no idea why. It turns out that, we were actually just kind of timing out on some of these structures. So the answer was, we need to start sharding and writing to multiple instances of that data store and then aggregating the totals from those data stores. So it's tough when you have that feature creep along with the scale.
How about you guys at Twitter?
Sure. The Fabric team runs quite differently than the rest of Twitter, and that really happened when Crashlytics was acquired a couple years ago. Crashlytics as a team became the culture that really inspired Twitter to scale that out and create a mobile platform. It started with Crashlytics being a team of 15 people and really organizing around the idea of engineers driving innovation and having feature teams that were dedicated to very small areas of expertise. And as we've built Fabric out, as Fabric has become very feature-filled, as we've developed SDKs for Twitter sign-on and sign-on with phone number using our existing SMS infrastructure, and the beta distribution, and the analytics SDK, and all the others, we put together these feature teams around each individual one. And we really made sure that even though we had these multiple feature teams that were cross-geo, that we instill a culture of communication, and that we instill a culture of alignment through those teams. We do that through a weekly process where on Monday the teams sync up and they commit to what they're going to do only through that week. And at the end of the week, we have a show and tell, and we are accountable for what we committed to. Our director of engineering, he's a brilliant man, Rich Perret. He strongly believes that it's very difficult for an engineer to accurately scope outside of 1 week. It becomes ballparks. And so by doing a quality-driven development lifecycle, you will always be iterating and you're always shipping customer value.
So you have a 1 week release cycle, or is it a 1 week release cycle?
Value doesn't necessarily have to be for the public customer. The customer could be for another team that's consuming it. It could be for a beta process. It could be for a PM for review. In the case of our SDKs, right now we're kind of playing with our cadence, but right now we're going with 1 month release cycles.
And how many total developers do you have working on Fabric?
The Fabric team is about 60 folks. On the Android side, I think we have 12 or 13. Now those, like I said, are spread up across multiple feature teams that work on different components. Some are on crash reporting, some are on beta, some are on the Fabric platform itself, where we focus on common shared code.
So Juan, how about with you guys?
Well, we're much smaller, but I think the key there is automation and processes too. So we have a 2-week cycle, similar to what Ty just described. We commit to what we're doing on those 2 weeks, and then we have something that we stole from Twitter. We have a train release model where the train lives every month. So each train basically has 2 full sprints, so 2 sets of 2 weeks worth of work, and a lot of automation. The more you can automate, the less you have to think about things, the less you have to sweat about things that are going to break or not get done on time. So automate and then have good processes around your development.
Anybody else want to chime in before we move on?
I would say at Cyanogen we also follow a similar process. We use agile methodology and the sprint cycles about 2 weeks, and then we have monthly milestone releases that we try to push out along with the nightly builds that people in their community can try out, although we don't necessarily want to see bug reports from those builds, but I think it's good to get it out there for people to start using it. And then now that we're working with other ODMs like OnePlus for the OnePlus phone, we have sort of a more formal releases that are actually go into production and get automatically OTA'd to hopefully millions of people.
So now let me go to the related question then. So if you've got all these different features and you want to roll them out to massive user bases, how are you actually doing the experimentation to figure out, okay, can we safely roll this out? What are the unknown unknowns that are going to bite us? If you're Facebook and you can have everybody over the web, you can just turn on a feature for a real small slice of people. But on Android, it's a little bit trickier because you're just pushing out your update to the Android store. So I'm kind of curious. Well, you're in Amazon, so how are you doing it?
You don't have to push out an APK or a feature change to absolutely everybody at once. You can actually push out a change just to a certain percentage of your installed user base, and you don't necessarily need to install a new APK at the App Store level to do that either. Okay, again, from an Amazon-centric point of view, we've got an API available where you can actually do A/B testing, and you can actually put in new segments of code that you can actually pass into your app, and then choose 2% of your population on which to run that, and find out really what falls over. Sometimes nothing falls over, and then you can go ahead and using the portal to switch that to 100% of the users. Then you can embed that in your formal code for the next update. But it gives you a mechanism that you can actually try it on a smaller subset of users.
How about you guys with Cyanogen?
Well, the rollouts are typically phased when, so a small percentage will get the update maybe in the first few days, and then if it looks good, we ramp it up to get the rest of the users.
Fair enough. Anybody else, or move on to the next little topic here?
Well, on the SDK side, it's very interesting in that your developers expect a level of consistency. So if you were A/B testing under the hood with SDKs, I don't think developers would enjoy that very much.
So what do you do?
So it's all about the feedback we get from developers, and working on that feedback, implementing that feedback, working with the developers in beta groups, testing our SDKs. For the rest of Twitter, it's very similar to Amazon's model, where we have an internal framework where developers can hypothesize how it's going to affect metrics. They can put it in code, they can A/B test that, and then they can judge that after a period of time and scale that up or down. But for SDKs, it's a kind of a different story.
Fair enough.
We kind of live in a bit of a different world too. With sports and broadcasting apps, the season starts on a certain day. The show is going to air on a certain day. And people are going to use this app. Millions of people are going to download it, and they're going to use it for like a 6-month period. And then they're going to forget about it until the next season. And so we pretty much just have to make those decisions as best we can ahead of time and just flip the switch and go for it. And if it fails or people don't like it, next season we'll do something differently.
All right, so let's, on the same vein, move into the deep dive into testing now. So testing on Android is kind of a nightmare in many ways. There's no one way to test. We've got tons of platforms. We've got the core instrumentation. We've got Roboelectric. We've got Robotium. We've got Espresso. And then, of course, you've got just those are running on different emulators. Now, how do we actually get devices out to test on physical devices, especially if you're a Cyanogen mod? I mean, how many different kinds of devices are you guys working with right now?
Well, I think in the Cyanogen mod, it supports over 100 devices. But the way that kind of works is that we have to rely on the user community to support and to test those builds. And most of those developers are willing to jump in and fix bugs and at least do a good job of reporting issues that they find. Right? They're sort of generally well informed about doing that, maybe more so than the average app user might be.
And how about the rest of you guys who are writing user-facing applications rather than custom builds, custom ROMs? What do you guys do at Amazon?
No comment.
All right, we're going to pick on Square. Jake, what do you got?
Yeah, so we've been very vocal about testing. We publish a few libraries and contribute to a few also that are not Square specific, solely around easing the pain of testing. I'm sure, as you all know, kind of fundamental design decisions very early on in Android really prevent you from doing what is traditionally thought of as how you would test something written in Java. So we rely on, I think, 3 separate types of tests. Unit tests are the big ones that we rely on. We have thousands for Square Register, for example. And we enforce all changes past those tests before making it into head, basically. Asynchronously, after that, we're constantly running our instrumentation tests, which are much slower and actually running through multiple screens and various flows of the app. Espresso-based and uses a library that we recently published called Burst to exercise kind of variations of different the data that's running through the test. And then you really can't get away without doing manual testing. So every 6 weeks when we have a train model as well, when our train is leaving, we have manual testing parties. And then an interesting thing that we also do is that Square Register at least is an app that you don't use daily, at least as a developer working on it. I am not a merchant. I'm not selling things daily. So we actually use it for all of our coffee bar internally and our lunches at work every day using the latest daily build, and you actually pay for these things and ultimately end up getting reimbursed for lunch, but it's really a great way to exercise the various functionalities. So we recently announced like an EMV reader, and that was just something that you really are just not able to test. We kind of had to force people to go and ask their banks for EMV cards, and you had to use EMV to pay for lunch. Otherwise, you had to go out. So.
All right, and let's pick on Larry here. So I'm going to throw you a curveball. How do you deal with test flakiness, things that are UI timing related, especially when you're running things that communicate across threads?
That tends to obviously be one of the more difficult things that we have to test. We do rely a lot on manual testing, as Jake said. And we've got some really good QA folks that can just pound the hell out of devices and really try to interact with them in strange ways. We will try to leverage some of the tools as well, something like Monkey, to pound on the device and pound on our interfaces as much as possible and make sure we're dealing with edge cases. And that's more or less how we try to handle that. We're a pretty small house, so doing large suites of automated tests gets to be really difficult for us. So we keep our QA team engaged from the beginning. So in our 2-week sprints on most of our projects, our QA team is very involved. And even as we're creating submits and interim builds, they're starting to test right then and there and getting feedback to us as quickly as possible.
So, can I go? We have a combination of the two. So we still have a lot of manual testing. We have an amazing QA team that really uses apps in all sorts of ways. And we have a combination of automated tests too. We were heavily invested in Robotium, but now we're making the change over to Espresso and trying to ramp up automated testing as much as we can to avoid your QA team being your bottleneck. Because when you're growing so fast, sometimes you can't hire people fast enough. So having a very robust automated test suite helps you at least know that from that perspective you're covered, and then the dependency you have on your QA team is reduced every day.
So looks like we've got an audience question here, but we're going to get you a microphone.
I can speak loud enough.
Come on up to the microphone so it gets picked up on the streaming. And then remember to go as well. You guys should all be submitting to Google Moderator. We're going to vote on questions here in just a little bit, but let's go ahead and have your question here.
Why are you migrating from...
Up, is the mic on?
Testing.
There you go.
Why are you moving from Robotium to Espresso? And can you elaborate the decisions and the benefits of Espresso?
But mostly that, I think, as far as I know, Robotium is not being worked on currently. So Espresso is where most of the development is happening. And so if you want to use all the nice new features of Espresso, you basically have to migrate because you're not going to get that on Robotium ever, I think.
There is a Robotium UI recorder, and they charge for it. And my understanding is somebody's working on at least on the recorder part of it, and Espresso doesn't have a recorder.
Okay, so they might be third parties that are working on it, but I don't think there's a lot going on the core of Robotium. So I think what most people are doing, they have either migrated to Espresso or are in the same process as we are. So I think there's a lot more happening in Espresso, a lot more activity, a lot more information, a lot more knowledge. And if you want to take advantage of that, I think the way to go is just to migrate to Espresso. At least that's the decision that we made.
Let's do a quick poll here. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah. Oh, I really want to dive in here.
Okay, go. Let's do it. Let's do it.
So Robotium is fundamentally flawed. The way that it's implemented, is it's kind of just a high-level wrapper on top of the normal instrumentation APIs that Android gives you for testing the UI. And so they don't really solve any of the actual hard problems that you face when you're writing UI and integration style tests, which is dealing with asynchronous operations through either like network-based calls or even the asynchronous UI operations, such as doing a fragment transaction. Something that doesn't happen synchronously ends up being posted to happen in the next frame. And so Espresso took a very unique approach that actually completely solves this, which is every operation that you make not only happens on the main thread, but it won't happen until the main thread's looper is actually clear of all messages. So as things like fragment transactions get posted or asynchronous tasks are running in the background, it's actually going to not execute anything and wait until all that has stopped. And even beyond that, if you're using something else to provide asynchronous execution that it doesn't know about, it gives you ways to hook into that. So if you're using a third-party library like Volley or Retrofit to do network calls, you can point it at those and say, don't do anything until there's no more network requests or anything running. And additionally, it also has an absolutely fantastic API, which you write much more declarative interactions that allow you to rather than having to do actual like almost more black boxy kind of testing of knowing how the UI is structured, it allows you to kind of step back a little and write a little more high level style tests that interact with your UI.
So I want to do a quick poll here just to find out which tools you guys are using for testing. So how many of you guys are using Espresso right now? All right, what about Cylindroid? Any Cylindroid? Appium? Espresso? Or we just did Espresso? Robotium? Nope. Okay, there we go. That kind of. What about just doing low-level instrumentation activity test? What about Roboelectric? And I'm really curious to hear what types of tests you're using with Roboelectric. Where do you see Roboelectric shining?
So we are in the process of migrating many of our tests from standard Android tests using Android test case to Roboelectric. It's a much faster solution for testing our business logic that doesn't necessarily have a lot of heavy interactions with the Android framework. And even where it does a fantastic job of creating shadow classes so that we can work with contexts and activities and things like that. Because it's running in the local JVM on the machine, it's running much faster. We work all the time on speeding up our builds. We have our CI system run all of our unit tests on every commit that runs through. So any speed increase we can get will be a bonus to the productivity of developers.
So are you testing activities themselves on Roboelectric, or are you testing more the services layer or business logic layers?
It's primarily business logic.
So you're trying to get underneath the hood, and it's just you only use Roboelectric to deal with the places we have dependencies under the underlying API, like Android log?
So generally, we try to architect our code in such a way that it is extremely testable. We adhere to like the single responsibility principle, and everything should be tested in isolation. And when you have those sort of unit tests where you can mock your network and you can pull these Android components out and have these clean interfaces to interact with them, it becomes really simple to feed those into either a standard unit test that's just going to run JUnit or Roboelectric.
Excellent. So that's going to lead to our next question here in just a moment on design for testability. But did you have something you'd wanted to add about how you guys are using Roboelectric right now?
Yeah. So we kind of practice very similar methodology. Ideally, we would not have to use Roboelectric, and we try to avoid it as much as possible. But it's a great like safety net where you have code that just has to interact with a bundle or just has to interact with an intent, and it's absolutely the wrong decision to wrap those in an interface or an abstraction just so that you can use like a pure JUnit test, because an intent and a bundle, they're just like maps, right? So Roboelectric gives you the real, close to the real implementation there, enough so that you can get through your test. And then we actually also kind of lean on it for the view-based stuff. There was a massive effort. Square actually employed the original guy that wrote Roboelectric, and we basically set him down for 3 or 4 months and said, like, get rid of all of these shadows. We want as much real code as possible running through Roboelectric. So version 2 and ultimately with version 3 that's being worked on right now, a lot of the code that's running is actually real Android Java code that's compiled to run on the JVM. So things like the entire view stack. So you can like measure views, you can do layout stuff. All that is real Android code. So you can expect actual behavior when you measure a view and I want to assert that it always remains perfectly square. You can run that in Roboelectric rather than having to actually run it on device and trust that it's running through the real view code.
And do you find that it's actually really representative of what you would get if you were running on the real device?
Yeah, as long as you stay, so people like abuse the hell out of it, right? I mean, people want to run all of their tests on the JVM. They want to be starting activities and doing tons of fragment stuff. And that's really not what it's for. It's really just kind of to provide that safety net and a little bit of the real code such that you can test the bits, test your code that just happens to have to run through Android code, by calling a super class method or having to interact with something like a bundle or an intent or the log.
Excellent. So let's switch over to the design for testability here. And let's see, we'll start with Dave, if you'd like to jump in a little bit on how you've been designing your apps for testability when you've got all these Android dependencies.
Well, that's actually a terrible question for me.
Okay.
No, because it turns out we don't, again, given the cycles of the applications that we work on and that sort of thing, we don't employ any real unit testing or any testing frameworks. We rely entirely on manual testing, given the short cycles of the applications that we develop. Again, the product cycles that we work on, or the project cycles, don't generally allow for any test time in the budget before we have to ship before the season starts. And we have the luxury in what we work on of when the season's over, we can throw that entire thing away and start over fresh the next year. So there's not a lot of regression or migration or anything that we really have to deal with. So we're kind of insulated from the whole problem, if you will.
Fair enough. How about the rest of you guys then?
Oh, I can. Well, ideally, we try to architect things in a way that we can later automate and test do some mocking. So you can employ, there's different patterns that you can use, and there's fortunately a lot of libraries that you can use to decouple your code and make it a little bit more testable. So that's kind of the strategy we have. We also have like our own implementation of some mocking and some like dependency injection on some places.
Tell us how you do that.
How we do what?
How you doing the mocking and dependency injection?
Well, the dependency injection for like simple stuff, we're using right now Butterknife. And then we have some custom things that we build. And then we also have some mocking that we build, inspired a little bit on Mockito, but we're also, on Mocktail, but we're looking at Mockito as something that we want to start doing. And because the iOS team uses Mocktail a lot, so we try to leverage some of the knowledge we have in-house on that. So it's mostly that, trying to architect things in a way that they're decoupled. You can test them as a separate unit. It's not always feasible, and as Jake said, sometimes when there's a core Android component in the middle of what you're doing, it's really hard to really get it out of there, so to get a clean like test unit. But then fortunately, there's libraries and frameworks that you can leverage to make it a little bit less painful. It's still a painful process, but if you architect things well and try to plan ahead with testing in mind, you can get it done.
I'd like to jump in here a little bit. You brought up dependency injection and mocking, and both of those are something that are really important to us as a team working on Fabric, but unfortunately, we can't just pull in any third-party dependency because we're delivering an SDK, and we need to keep it extremely lightweight. So we don't get to use a beautiful tool like Dagger to inject our dependencies. But that doesn't mean that we can't follow the dependency injection design pattern. And so creating components that take their dependencies up front, that aren't running as singletons, that don't have static methods that you cannot mock, that aren't final so Mockito can't handle them. You have all of these isolated components that are following the single responsibility principle, and then you can start testing these in isolation across your different tools. When you're interacting with the Android activities or fragments or whatever, then following a design pattern where you can break that out and you can have your business logic in one class and your presenter bound to the activity in another, and then the activity is almost a shell of what's going on and interacting with the app framework, really allows you to be in a position where you can test exactly your business logic and rely on the system to do what it's going to do.
So how are you doing that? How are you actually making the activity not contain the business logic, but call the business logic when we don't necessarily have the state binding, model view controller architecture in Android?
I think there's a lot of ways to do it. Unfortunately, we don't have to deal with as many activities as doing SDKs as would be painful. But the approaches generally resolve around tracking the life cycle and binding a controller to that activity. And once you have that controller bound to it, it can manage its state and it can track what's going on. You can then use that in your testing, and you can rely on its implementation that's going to be called, and then you can mock the class that it's working with, or the fragment, or the activity, that sort of thing. Testing is pretty important to the culture of our team. Automation is in general. So generally, we believe that code isn't done and it can't be submitted into master until it has appropriate test coverage that goes with it.
So you've rolled your own kind of controller binding framework with the activities, and you've rolled your own dependency injection engine since you can't use a third party?
Well, I wouldn't say we've rolled our own dependency injection framework, as it's just a design pattern. Generally, you take everything you're dependent on up front in the constructors or an initialization call.
What about the activities themselves?
The activities themselves, generally, you want to leave out of your tests as much as possible.
How do they get a hold of their dependencies?
Generally, in their on create or they're on resume, they'll bind to that singleton controller.
Fair enough. So you're using singleton. That was the gist of my question there.
Okay.
Excellent.
Yeah.
And anybody else want to jump in on the design for testability before we go on to another topic? And guys in the audience, feel free to submit questions as well. I don't know if we have any questions yet on testing, but we can use it, and then we can go on to our next item.
I think I would just like to add that designing for testability is important, but it's also a balance. Like, you can follow all these design patterns to a T, and you'll have all these nice abstractions, these interfaces that you can mock. But when it comes down to it, you really still need to ship your app. And there's a balance between the right abstractions and the number of those abstractions versus just doing the thing that gets it done and kind of coming back to it later. So the train model kind of forces you to walk that line. The fact that you are shipping every 4 to 6 weeks or whatever, yes, you want to abstract things. Yes, you want these nice clean lines between the components that you're testing, but sometimes you really just need to kind of shove it in there so you can get it out the door. And then that's a great thing to kind of come back to after you've done that release is, cleaning up and maybe abstracting some of those things and making some of those lines cleaner for testability. So it doesn't always have to be upfront as part of your design, but it can be something that can be done incrementally over time.
And thought I'd throw out just testing at the embedded level. So this is a good question for Larry and Howard here. If either of you want to chime in and how you're testing your embedding applications or in your embedded systems.
Sure, I'll jump on this one. So we'll generally tend to write some type of unit test cases. Obviously, if we're working at the embedded level down within kernel drivers or a HAL layer or something like that, we don't necessarily have a framework that we'll use, something like you would up in Java with JUnit or something like that. Many times we'll still try to construct our libraries or our drivers in the same modular way, the same design principles, and even try to extract some of those components out into a test framework. We've even gone so far as to test core driver components, but not test them within the kernel. We've pulled them up into application space and actually run them through a whole series of tests up in application space so that we know they're reliable down in the kernel.
Excellent. It looks like we have an audience question here.
Yeah.
Speaking to the microphone here.
Do you guys also test on external services, like making actual HTTP requests from the instrumentation test and stuff like that, or is it something that you guys just mock it? I'm just curious to know how you guys test whether actually do HTTP request on, I don't know, instrumentation test or something like that.
I could say at least for us, so there's a couple ways that we do that. I could say totally for our instrumentation test, all the networking layer is mocked, simply because we want to be running them constantly and not dependent on some external service. I think it's an interesting idea to be able to run a one-off integration style test with an actual real backend, hopefully a staging backend. But the way we kind of get around that is the server implementation is responsible for testing itself as a client, with some kind of client through the actual API. And then the client is simply responsible for mocking out that API. And because we're sharing a schema definition of both the API endpoints and the data that's both in the request and response for those API endpoints, it's that kind of means there's agreement on both sides of the mock and the server-side client testing. So we don't really actually need to do that hookup between something real and the actual client.
Actually, I'd like to answer testing embedded systems. One of the V1s I worked on had a tablet that had an RF reader underneath a pad of paper, and it had a pen that you would use to write. It would go to the embedded system. A little screen mounted on the tablet would give you some ways to interact with what you've just created. And creating a hardware prototype is phenomenally expensive and really complicated. So before we did this, we really wanted to make sure we had the software figured out. So we simulated a lot of the pen inputs, we simulated a lot of what the user would do, and we figured we had it nailed. So we went ahead and had the prototype built, we got everything done. One of the things we hadn't considered was the environment that our embedded system actually lived in. It turned out there was so much signal noise from a user actually using this thing, our software couldn't operate the way we kind of expected it to when we were testing it. So testing it without a real world understanding of the environment that it would actually be functioning in actually costs a fair amount of money and time. So embedded systems need to consider environments.
All right, so we got a question here from Kevin in Seattle. Kevin in Seattle, who's watching us live streaming, he asks, Square and Netflix have contributed concrete alternatives to Android's base classes. Jake, you mentioned that you discouraged loaders and fragments, and then he goes on and says, RxJava enables functional reactive architecture. What alternative architectures are Android devs considering when moving and considering scale?
I guess I'll take that one.
He did name you.
Yeah, so we jumped on the fragment and loader bandwagon. Basically, day one of the support library. It looked like, so the pattern that fragments and loaders are affording you is something very well known, but the implementation is extremely lacking. For relatively simple apps, they work phenomenally. So if you have multiple activities, each of which is managing only, a handful, and even a handful is probably too much, 2 or 3 fragments each, you're probably going to be fine. We really wanted to move to a single activity model in which everything is living in a single window. And Fragment Manager is just this opaque box into which you have no real hooks or inspection into its state. So you have to synchronize your state externally and just hope that they're in sync. That, along with various bugs and inconsistencies across versions, the asynchrony that it implements, trying to do transactions and dealing with dialogues which live in a totally separate window, the nested state machines, and now that we have nested fragments, you have state machines and state machines and state machines. Really, it's just, I think the fundamental problem that we found is that they were created in a way that was trying to be everything to everyone. And by doing so, it had no opinions, and it just became this large API with this large lifecycle that was very hard to understand and had bugs. And so after suffering thousands of crashes for probably about 16 months, we just decided to get rid of it because we had this stuff before. We had views, we had smart controllers, and we had things that managed the kind of transaction model of animating in and out different views. Like this, fragments didn't bring anything new. The fact that they were able to be backported to Donut means that it's just code that's running, managing views. There's like nothing special going on. So we've always been able to do this ourselves, but there was nothing like really well done and core that was shipped out by Google. And so we were sad to see this, but we were not that sad to tear them completely out of our applications. And through that, we've implemented, I think, at least 4 different versions of our own kind of fragment and fragment manager. One of the reasons that these haven't been open sourced, although one's been open sourced, but I don't want to talk about that.
Okay.
One of the reasons is that we design it for exactly what we need. So we don't have to write this thing that's going to be everything to everyone, and we don't have to design these APIs that are going to be perfect for everyone. All we have to do is solve our use cases, which is a vast subset compared to what the entire Android ecosystem has to deal with. So to kind of give concrete, I guess, advice here, there's nothing wrong with using fragments at a very small scale. It's really when you only want to have these ambitious goals like a single activity model, or you have a very large application with these really deep nested hierarchies and complex state that dictates what's on the screen, that you really need to look at something else, because every single version that we shipped where we tore more and more fragments out, our crash rate dove basically by a measurable amount. And we're adding features, we're adding tons of features. There's 14 people working on register, and we're shipping new features every 6 weeks. And every 6 weeks, our crash rate still drops. And when you look back and you look at the reasons why, it's because of the way that we were trying to abuse fragments into this single activity model. And so I don't want to say that there's an alternative, because there really isn't. You either just have to kind of assume fragments and deal with what comes with them, or figure out what's best for you. And maybe that means writing something very simple that just manages views and a simple backstack, and just do it yourself. Although maybe we'll release something else in the future.
I was going to ask that question, or at least release an example of how you did it.
Yeah, it's like 500 lines of code to replace just the view management, backstack, persisting stuff, where you can get your multi-pane, all that kind of stuff. It's not a lot of code. It's really when you need to add in all of those crazy features that fragments provide that your code starts exploding, and you have all these edge cases. That's where it kind of goes south. So for our applications, we avoid those edge cases, which keeps our integration simple. And yes, it's not applicable to everyone, but it has worked out phenomenally. And now we have each one of our applications has no fragments in it. It's all single activity stuff, and our crash rate consistently is declining.
Wow. So let's go to the other part of his question, which was reactive Java. So given the threading complexities inside of Android right now, which is managing all the communication between the UI thread and your background threads and whatnot, it kind of screams opportunity for reactive style programming. Is anybody actively using reactive Java or reactive style programming in their architectures at scale right now?
So I guess that's probably me again. All three of our apps use it. We lean on it extremely heavily. The problem with RxJava, it's not really a problem. The problem with using RxJava in Android is that RxJava really wants to be a framework, not a library, which means you're going to be doing a lot of manual kind of lifting and shimming it into your application and dealing with all the APIs that it provides. And in fact, you almost don't want those in things like your activities, your views, and your fragments, or like services. Because it's too much. There's way too many things. You can do it, but you're going to be writing a lot of code. So we have various internal helpers that allow us to do things like simpler binding into views. And there's actually a Rx Android module that's a sibling module built on top of RxJava, which is open source, part of the same project suite, that kind of gives you some of those things which allows you to bind this asynchronous observable concept to Android concepts like the activity lifecycle, the fragment lifecycle, view lifecycle, and it also has a sample application that's slowly being built out to kind of show these concrete patterns of how you can use asynchronous event-driven, like reactive programming in order to drive both the data layer and your UI layer.
You can open source these examples too?
It's in the Rx Android. The Rx Android project has a sample in it. It's kind of like a little Wild Westy right now, where it's trying to figure out who it is and like what needs to live in this project. So it's something that's really getting a lot of attention right now, and a lot of work is going into it. So over the next few months, you'll see it being built out into hopefully a extremely useful sample with a lot of concrete patterns that you can take out and hopefully just drop right in your application.
Excellent. So we're going to move into now supporting global customers, and we're looking for questions as well from the audience. So those of you who are working with global customers right now, you've got customers all over the world, you've got crash reports all over the world, support requests coming from all over the world. Engineering teams eventually, we'll take that as a separate topic that may be spread all over the world, but we'll save that for a separate subject. How do you deal with Android at scale when you have a worldwide customer base? How is that affecting your practices, and what are you doing?
Actually, not that differently than you would do it in any other language, really. Internationalization occurs even at the components at the smallest level. Abstract as much as you can. Resource files, so your friend, I'm not kidding. You'd be surprised how many things you find left out of resource files. I really want to, and so if you make just a good programming habit of abstracting these things, you can actually get really far. It gets tricky when you get to some right to left languages, when the guy who's done some of your layout XML hasn't really thought about the right to left length, or the fact that simple nouns in German can take up 2/3 of your screen. So sometimes you need to set a policy on, are we going to have absolute character limits, and does that mean we need to break a resource file for a word we might use in German, or do we want to build a new layout XML for right to left if just doing a mirror image is going to be a train wreck for the UI. So those are the things that we spend our time really thinking about and really working on inside of our internationalization and localization efforts. Internationalization and localization are not the same things. Internationalization is preparing your code to accept a localized set of strings, and not just words, but conventions as well, that make your app applicable for that particular language and or culture set. The other thing you said that really strikes a chord with me is support when you get to scale. When we were starting a lot of our V1s, a lot of the support calls would come back to, you know, the test manager, or if we didn't really have a big enough team for a test manager, it was whoever was in charge of the testing, right? And the test lead would figure this out, figure out what was going on, and let the dev manager know. Pretty soon, that doesn't scale. And at that point, you decide you're going to hire your first, you know, support guy. And the support guy always comes to the team with really great stories. I mean, the support guy comes to you with fantastic ideas, for one, things you can fix, but two, as you start increasing the scale and you start touching more customers, they come back with ways of using what you've written in ways that really were never intended. A good story of this is we were building some education software, and it would take a look at what you were studying, and it would ask you questions about it. You know, Pythagorean theorem, a squared, b squared, c squared. And then, you know, you take the square root of c, you get the hypotenuse, right? Well, if the kid knows he's supposed to do that, but every time he gets c squared, he just divides by 2, well, you know that he doesn't need to study Pythagorean theorem. He needs to study square roots, right? So we built this system that figured out programmatically what prerequisite he was missing in order to get the concept. You'd never think that that application would apply to HVAC installation and repair at a significant level. Well, guess what someone did? If you're installing a new HVAC system on the roof of a high-rise, you have documentation. You know, we called it a lesson plan. They called it installation instructions, right? And they get through the first lesson, and then the installation repairman answers questions about how stuff looks, how stuff works, and if it doesn't match what's supposed to happen, oh, holy cow, if you're seeing this, that means you need to make the following repairs before you continue the installation. And that cut down their, their faulty installation rate and made fixes a whole lot cheaper, a whole lot faster. We didn't know that they were going to use it this way. What did that mean? That meant instead of students who mostly submit written text as answers, these guys wanted the repairman to be able to submit pictures taken from their phones. Holy cow, we didn't know that. That's a great new feature we can add because we had a support engineer telling us a story. When you're considering outsourcing your technical support offshore or to a building full of people on phones, you're going to lose the stories. So think really carefully if you want to lose the stories when you think about outsourcing support.
I want to talk about this one a little bit. When we think about internationalization and a global audience from an SDK perspective, you have the obvious accessibility where you need to have localized languages. You need to have your views that support RTL. But really, fragmentation becomes much more of an issue there because you don't get to make the choice on the specific devices that your app is running on. You want to have the broadest range possible for your SDK, which means that your developers are choosing the devices they run in, and you don't want to be limiting them. So it's all about being able to gracefully degrade and run with the minimum amount of features and permissions in almost every case, trying to have the lowest possible Android API version. So even if API 15 is the new Min SDK that people are recommending, in an SDK, we're considering 8 at this point. We have to keep it much lower because we do have customers in many emerging markets where they are old devices still going out, low-powered devices still going out, where we can't have the same affordances that app developers have.
So we also have an international audience, and we do payments. And fortunately, a lot of the payment part, it's done on the back end, but payments are hard. Payments don't work the same way they work in the US and the rest of the world. Time zones are really hard. Dates are hard. So we handle events in different time zones and different dates, and sometimes you need to be consistent. So our backend, fortunately, handles a lot of that, but when you're working on your app, you have to be thoughtful of things like dates and currencies and of course, languages. And German is great for testing because it screws up your design. Also, make sure you test with languages that have accents because they tend to mess with your design too. So all those things, you have to be mindful when you have a global audience of all those things that work really differently than how they work here in the US. And that's an important mindset to get to. I've listened to a few people from Facebook, and I actually follow their advice. One of my test devices is a Moto E, which is not as hardcore as some of they usually have a Galaxy Y, I think, which is a tiny device of 320. It's a ridiculous resolution. So don't think that everybody has a Nexus 5. Don't think that that's what the rest of the world uses, because it's not. So make sure you give your app a spin on one of the devices that have a tiny screen or a slow processor to make sure that the experience is still good, because a lot of the people outside of the US, those are the devices they use on a daily basis.
Yeah, and that actually brings up another point about these devices, especially in the emerging markets. A lot of times they don't have a lot of RAM. So definitely keep in mind and profile your app for memory usage, and look for memory leaks, or make sure. One common thing that we saw is sometimes when you rotate the screen, the new activity pops up, and all of a sudden your app was using twice as much RAM as it was before. So definitely look out for those type of things, and yeah, the customers will appreciate it, and so will we, because we have to do a lot of work to make Android run well on some of these either old devices or some of the new devices which have maybe not the greatest hardware specs.
So we got another audience question here. So this one is from let's see here, Santiago. Let's see, the username is K de Moya from Santiago, and the question is: there's an uprising interest in open source technologies. Are companies actually aware of the talented and passionate developers in the community? And also, is your team and company doing something about trying to acquire off-country developers? So this brings us out to both open source community management as well as globalizing our development teams.
You're looking straight at me for some reason.
You're nodding at me like this hits home for you.
We actually have a group at Amazon specifically centered around dealing with open source contributions and contributing back and using open source contributions. So we actually have a fair amount of process around engaging with and giving back to the open source community.
What does that process look like?
It depends entirely on what we're doing, and I don't want to get into stuff that my attorneys would really get angry at me for talking about. But we're certainly encouraged to go ahead and contribute back to open source communities if it's not going to be divulging corporate IP or company secrets. We just have a process by which we submit what we want to contribute back. It's reviewed for IP cleanliness. And it's actually encouraged, and it's a good thing. It's broadening.
So we definitely don't want you to get anything that your lawyers would step on you for. But if you were giving advice to, hypothetically giving advice to a company out there that is looking to improve their processes around engaging with the open source communities, what are some things they need to think about?
Don't ask a developer. Don't ask me. Ask an attorney. I know it's a horrible answer, guys. I'm really sorry. But it's true, because the last thing you want to do is lose any intellectual property rights you have to your code base because you've included 12 lines of something that you got from a project that had the wrong license. That's painful, and it's completely avoidable, too. And the last thing you want to make your engineers do is pretend that they're attorneys. They exist for a good reason occasionally.
Now, at Square, you're pretty open source friendly. How do you guys decide what to open source and what to keep internally?
So it's mostly engineer driven. I would say it's almost entirely engineer driven, actually.
The opposite of Amazon, where it's lawyer driven.
We still have the same kind of IP legal and license review that every project has to go through. But the projects that ultimately get open, there's nobody there, sifting through your code saying, "Oh, this looks nice. You should open source that." It's really down to the person and people who are working on these teams that have either written the software or are living in that service or app that are really driving the open sourcing of these components. So we don't have too many formal processes around it, but we kind of employ a mentality of these either platform-specific groups or language-specific groups that really do a peer review. So if I'm going to open source something Android-specific, I want another Android developer, or hopefully 2 or 3, to actually look at it. It's the same for Ruby, Go, and all the other languages or platforms that we contribute to, and then ultimately we go through that process and push it open source if it's deemed appropriate. So it's really kind of engineer driven. And then through that, we've seen, absolutely fantastic feedback and bug fixes, which is the best because we open source this software that we're actually using in our apps, and somebody fixes a bug, well, my app just got a little bit better for free. So there's a lot of, and we've also hired multiple people that we've discovered solely through their contributions to our open source projects. So there's really a lot of return value, even though it's a lot of investment to us as engineers. You can get a lot of return value if you go through that whole process.
I want to ask you about Cyanogen Mod. You have a lot of native code as well in your systems, and it's all open source. How do you worry about people slipping in buffer overflow vulnerabilities or things that could really compromise the system?
Yeah, I guess that's kind of a concern you could say. But one thing I'd like to say is that Cyanogen has over 9,000 people from the community who have contributed to it over the years. So we definitely take a lot of contributions, and most of the work we do on the platform is all just in the open source. But I think one of the good things about open source with regard to security is that people can review the code, right? And there's I know Google has people auditing all their code. Probably the NSA looks at code trying to find buffer overflows so they can, get your figure out what terrorists are doing. But I think open source, in a way, can help make things safer. And sure, people have to be careful of buffer overflows. I mean, that's something that is quite common in native code, like you say. I guess in managed code, maybe it's a little bit harder to find an exploit for something like that. But I think just that's where code review is your friend.
So do you guys have a dedicated process for how you do your code review on those open source projects, and what you bring into mainline and bring back into your company?
Yeah, it's all done through Garrett. There are some Git repositories which are kind of owned by the contributors. If somebody is the device owner for a particular device, they have the ability to push commits. But I think there's kind of a strong meritocracy in place where people will do a pretty good job reviewing the code.
What about the hardware abstraction layer? That's not open source, so how do you work around that?
Well, that's actually difficult, and it's also probably one of the more interesting and fun things to do too. Like for example, when Android changes to a new version, a lot of times the API might change between KitKat and L release. So then if we only have the KitKat binaries, usually there's some hoops that we'll need to jump through in the code to make them work. There's been ugly things that have been done in the past, which sometimes are necessary, like writing wrappers around the library to kind of morph the new API into the old API. But yeah, and I'm always hoping that someday hardware manufacturers will open source some of that library code. But I do understand that there's that's where a lot of the secret sauce goes. So
it is indeed. So now I want to move to our two consultants here, Dave and Larry. So you're on the other end of this, where you want to be consuming open source, and you're on really tight time to market constraints. So start with Dave here. And what you're looking to leverage and how you leverage these things.
Yeah, I mean, I was going to jump in a little bit on there because we don't contribute a lot to open source necessarily. But the one thing that I kind of wanted to add to that discussion, because we do consume quite a bit of open source code, as dependencies in our applications. And the one thing that I would tell to any developers who are looking to do that is to, above all, respect the licenses that people put on their open source. Like the question said, we've got some very talented developers here who spend a lot of time open sourcing their code. And they also generally spend a lot of time choosing the license that they put on that code for a reason. And people often look at open source and they think that equals free code. And oftentimes the license chosen has certain restrictions or certain attributions associated with that you have to respect the choice that developer made, because they're giving you that for no money, but there are still some strings you have to play along with.
So does that, for you, mean you're simply avoiding certain licenses, or how does that affect your choice of open source and what you use?
Yeah, it's per project for sure. Different clients feel differently about certain licenses, and so there are cases where we have to avoid a specific library. We may have to rewrite that from scratch because they're not comfortable with the license on it, and we would rather do that than just breach the license. And there are some things like GPL code that we pretty much have to completely avoid just because we can't go open sourcing, the applications we're writing on top of that. So we have to do that, and we do it per project, often with the client, to decide what are they comfortable with, because in the end, anything they're comfortable with is going to make our jobs easier and make it faster to get to market before the season starts.
Fair enough.
I think it's exactly the same on our end. The key for us is always communication with our customers and being upfront with them and very engaging with them and letting them know what the impact of the project is going to be when going with an open source library or some type of open source technology. In many cases, we will try to push for it and make sure that they're okay with it and what the restrictions are, what the strings are that come with that license, and get buy-in from our customers whenever possible. And in some cases where they're not comfortable with that, then we do have to seek alternatives or write our own. So we're basically in the same boat, but communication is definitely key there.
So what are some of the libraries? So people who are watching this going, so what libraries should I be using? What are some of the libraries that you consider indispensable, that it's on every project, if you can use it, you use it?
I don't know that I could point at any one thing specifically because it depends on the project. It really depends on what we're targeting.
How about you, Dave?
Well, most of them are written 2 doors down, but essentially, we do. We heavily use a fair amount of Square's libraries. We use Picasso quite a bit. We use Retrofit pretty heavily, and there have been a few apps recently where we started to pull in Dagger as well. For simplify some of that code path. I personally have kind of an old feeling on this in that I don't like having to deal with other people's code whenever possible. So, because in the long run, more often than not, I end up either disliking the way it was done and wanting to rewrite it anyway, or just don't want to have to maintain that as a dependency. So I tend to push for fewer dependencies where possible, but there have been so many great libraries that guys like Square have put out that they make our jobs too easy sometimes to justify rewriting some of that on a short timeline.
And there's also not just the license side, but also when you start using an open source library, it's also a contract with the people that are nice enough to put it out for you to use it. And I think, and Jake deals with this all the time, people go into your project and just throw error codes at your GitHub issues and think that you're gonna solve them and you're employed by them. It's also understanding that you are part of that process. You're part of the open source. So if you're going to file an issue, be as descriptive as you can. Try to work with the person that is helping you, and if possible, try to contribute a patch. If there's something that you think might be done in a better way, or that you're using on a different way, try to contribute that too. So it's not just the licensing part, and if it's a license that you can use or not, but try to be also part of that open source process. Try to contribute. If you can write a patch, then try to write good issues that can help the person actually writing the patch, and not just throwing error messages over the wall and waiting for the library to get better.
To add to that just a little bit, I've seen too many teams fork a library to fix a specific bug and not send the PR back up, and I think it's super important. We're all involved in this community. We'll all make it better together. If you fix an issue, let people know, send up PRs, help out.
Teams and entire companies.
Yeah, entire companies, definitely.
I won't name names.
All right, so this next question is for you. We've got Max in San Francisco writes, how do analytics help in building better apps? That just sounds like right up your alley here with Twitter Fabric.
I don't know anything about analytics. Analytics, there's a lot of different types of analytics. If we take, for example, the Twitter for Android team, we talked a little bit earlier about how we do A/B testing and we can scale that out. Those sort of analytics let you make crucial product decisions. You can know that one implementation of a feature is more profitable than another feature, or drives more user engagement than another feature. Twitter as a company is very set on data-driven decisions. And that means that up front, it's important that you hypothesize this change and what it means and how it'll affect the specific metrics that you're looking for. And you can only get to that point by having really good metrics. And so by creating a system where you are reporting analytics for all of these different sorts of flows, it becomes very easy for a developer or a product manager or for anyone to hop in and say, I think if we change the follow button to giant flashing red, that we'll get more engagement. And maybe you do, and then maybe you see your overall users drop significantly because they hate the the flashing red. On the SDK side, it's a little bit different because you have these different ways of approaching it. We have an analytics platform, and we're very opinionated about our analytics platform. It's not Google Analytics. It's not that verbose and has that many user flows, but it does show some specific things, and we try to put some intelligent learnings around it. It'll show stability over time, the number of crash-free users. It'll show session length, the number of active users that are in your app right now, and the different types of activities that you're using. And by having that sort of information, it allows you to make high-level decisions. It may not be the exact sort of analytics that a product manager wants to walk through for an entire user flow, but it does allow you to correlate the crashes with the analytics that are associated with them, and then you can derive from that data, and you can see some intelligent things, like you released this new version, and all of a sudden this number of specific crashes is just dropping by a couple %. But when you see that as a pattern, you can notice that that may be a significant problem, and by us alerting you to that, you can recognize that early and get a fix out, as opposed to waiting for it to affect your entire user base.
Kind of coming from a different standpoint with analytics, so analytics in the app are obviously great, but we actually leverage analytics in other areas which are extremely helpful. And kind of going back to what you said about the support person and their stories, for every support inquiry that comes in, we put it in a bucket based on what a very specific thing that was either causing the problem or what they were asking for. And then those are ranked as percentages of overall support tickets. So if a user is getting stuck in a particular flow and having to call into support in order to get them out of it, and that accounted for 8% of all support tickets, and that's the number one thing that support has to deal with. Well, if we as engineers and as our designers can solve that in a way such that if the user gets stuck in that flow, in the actual app, there's some way for them to, fix themselves or get out of it. We can then reduce the support load by 8%. And basically, over time, with every release, we kind of always make sure that we're very aware of the top support inquiries and how much load they're actually placing on our supporters. Because you don't want to become, depending on whatever size you are, whether you're a single developer just triaging emails, or you're, a global company that employs hundreds of supporters, you don't want to be scaling your support infrastructure, to infinity. You want to be ensuring that you're always, as your app is growing, that you can maintain the same level of support without having to place undue burden on them simply because you're ignoring the most common things that are coming in. So rather than, still analytics in the app, but ensuring that you're kind of tracking things that will directly affect the app even though they're not originating in the app.
Juan, are you guys doing any analytics-driven development?
We do a lot of analytics, and I think analytics is a great tool for you to choose where you spend your energy. Sometimes there's things that excite you and you think are really cool, but then when you measure the engagement, you realize that they're not making a difference. For instance, my talk here at AnDevCon was born out of analytics. I realized that a lot of the users that we were getting were out of deep links on our app. It was driving a lot of purchases, and it's something that we didn't really thought would make a big difference, so I decided to try to share some of that. So we look a lot of analytics to make sure that the stuff that we're doing creates the impact that we hope, and then that way we decide on what to focus our energies. And sometimes we run experiments, and fortunately there's great analytics tools where you can run experiments, see what works, what doesn't, and then see if you want to continue that path or just switch to something else.
What are you guys using for your analytics platform?
We use something that's created by the guy next to me.
Twitter Fabric.
Yeah, we use a lot of the crash analytics tools. They're great.
For latency, we like to look at kind of it on two pivots. One is for analytics, we want to look at things like latency. when when a student submits a question back to the server, how long is it before we can render the next question? Well, we have an idea about how long it should take under optimal conditions, but in the real world, it's really useful to know what the actual user experience is, because that will drive a lot of really where we put effort in modifying things in upcoming releases, seeing how your app actually behaves in the real world. The second thing is, again, user interface optimization. If you're in a particular screen and you can get to the next important step by pressing a button, that's great. But if you measure where you are to that next important step, and most of the users get there by going up 2 menu levels, hitting a button to get back down there, yes, ultimately they're getting there and they're completing the task, but it means that you've got a serious UI failure if most of your access to this screen from that screen comes from some not optimized user workflow. So again, that can, people behave differently in the real world than they do when you're looking at them through two-way glass or in beta tests. So it's handy to have that instrumentation.
Excellent. So we're reaching towards the end of our segment here. So what we'd like to do is invite people to be coming up to the microphones and continue submitting questions via Google Moderator. We're going to start cloning more questions from the audience. And while people are queuing up at the microphone or sending in their questions, I thought I'd throw the analytics question out to Larry and Dave. You guys are working with a number of different customers through your consultancies. So are these really interested in how are you baking analytics into yours, or is it more about just time to market and getting out the first release?
No, actually, analytics is huge with all of our clients, to the point where getting analytics right will trump features in the app. Like, sports and broadcasting specifically, they love their analytics. Analytics drive, some of it is because analytics drive revenue. There are some analytics packages, and there are some applications where we've had up to 7 analytics packages in one app. Okay, and that's partially because this advertiser requires analytics from this source, and so some of it drives revenue, but they actually do look at some of that data too. And to kind of go back to the question we had earlier about testing, I said, well, we don't really have the life cycle of an app to do things like A/B testing or rollout features or anything like that. Analytics is where we get that data. If I spend 6 months working on this amazing bracket view for the tournament and nobody looks at it in the app, there's no point in spending that much effort on it next year. But if everybody looks at it, I have justification to make it even more awesome the next year. So we live and die by the analytics just as much as our clients do, and that's king for them every time.
Are you guys building analytics at all in the Cyanogen mod?
Yeah, there are some around the CM account, and we definitely get some feedback from that, and also from the installer that we have. And it is useful mostly to see what devices people really care about, and get ideas about what we should port to and things like that. So I think analytics are helpful.
Larry.
Yeah, I would agree with Dave. It's absolutely critical to our customers as well to understand how their app's being used, how the typical user flow is going through, and we work very closely with them to try to create the right user experience, but also make sure after the fact, during our rollout, that it is working as planned, and if not, pivot on that and make some adjustments accordingly.
Excellent. How about the audience here? Anybody got questions for our panelists? Yeah, come on up to the microphone here.
So I just wondered if you guys have any good resources for learning Android, or what are your favorite resources?
I'll tell you my favorite resource is let's go out to training in NewCircle. That's just my pet peeve, our pet project, I should say. But let's open it up to the panelists here. How are you guys and your engineers getting trained?
We typically do it with our own internal training that we'll pass off to people, and then the documentation that's already out there.
The documentation is a fantastic source of learning. The Android team's done a great job of documenting a lot of that. The examples are fantastic. On top of that, there's a lot of great books on the market. A lot of great.
What's your favorite book?
A long time ago, I read the Busy Coder's Guide by Mark Murphy. I've been a big fan of his for a little while.
Ty recommended that book to me, and at that point was the best book I read. I haven't really gone back to check what's out in the market, so the documentation is fantastic, and Busy Coder's Guide is definitely one of my favorites.
Yeah, I would say I like to rely on the Android documentation as a primary source, but then there's also plenty of presentations that various people have put together over the years, and they're not all maybe up to the latest version of Android, but sure, you can certainly get a lot of good information if you read through all those sources.
So the documentation's good. It's really hard to find. It's really hard to find great content for various different levels. I think the training stuff that Google's put out is very good for people that are beginner introductory level, people that we have joining, or just that that have maybe have programming experience but not specifically Android. It's hard to find good recommendations for things as the platform evolves. Where can I point people to really learn about these new, very complex things? And some of the dev bites that Google's been putting out starts to address that. But in general, there's this wealth of knowledge that's just spread very thin over the internet, be it through personal connections on various social networks or blogs, that I don't think there's a really good aggregate of that you can point people at. So it is very challenging once you get to that intermediate stage of how you kind of move up to the next level and really find those pieces of content that give you a lot that you can pull from it and actually apply into an application.
Lynda.com and Stack Overflow. No, I'm just kidding. I've seen probably the most effective learning take place with good mentorships. We pair up junior guys or mid-level guys with really senior engineers who are kind of recognized as key thinkers and leaders in their space. And you'd be surprised at how quickly some junior developers can move into being really solid contributors that way.
Yeah, I was going to say the same thing. I mean, internally, we do mentorship programs. Possible hires a lot of developers straight out of college, and we find the easiest way to bring them up to speed quickly is to throw them right on a project and have them paired up and mentored with a senior developer on that same project, and they can kind of bring them up through the work that they're doing at the same time. As far as books, Busy Coder's Guide was the first thing I picked up 5 so years, and it did me good. I guess I should plug my own Android Recipes A-Press as well.
I'm surprised no one mentioned it, but the community on Android is fantastic. There's so many great, really smart people out there and so much material that's being produced. I would say that outside of the books and the common resources, that getting involved in the community is probably the fastest way to fast-track yourself.
So other than SF Android Meetup, where else do you go to really plug into the pulse of the Android community?
Let's hear what Jake was going to say first. And then
I mentioned it.
You said wealth of knowledge across the internet.
Yeah, well, it's just spread out. You just have to find the right people.
Yeah, but I think to make it more specific, I think following certain people in the community on social networks, Twitter or Google Plus or whatever you use, it's a great way to know what's out there, what's happening when you see people complaining about or talking about the problems they're having. It's a great way to know what's out there, what the pain points are, things that you need to really look at, what people are doing. So following people in the community on social networks is a great way to keep up with what's happening on Android.
All right, so what's your Twitter ID so we can figure out who you follow? We got another audience question here, so let's hear it.
Okay. I almost don't know how to ask this, but Android basically sucks. I mean,
Get out.
I've seen it. So,
everything sucks, though.
I mean, I know.
He has a Windows phone in his pocket, doesn't he?
No. BlackBerry. But I've had a couple of beers, and that's why I can say this. But in 1.6, I mean, even as you look at activity and it had set wallpaper. I mean, it should be just encapsulating the life cycle. I mean, you look at J2ME, and which was horrible, but even Android was even worse. And Jake, you've done such a great job at trying to, help with things like the action bar, which was horrendous, and all kinds of things. And I appreciate that. And the event bus, which is great. But is there any hope? I mean, it just seems to get worse sometimes.
Help us, Obi-Wan.
I don't know what to do. I mean, we try, you look at async task and sometimes it's going to be serial, and then hey, let's change it so it's not serial, and then let's make it serial again. I just don't know what to do. I mean, I wish there was a company up here. You've done such great. I mean, Square has contributed more than any other company. It just seems there should be a company.
Except Google.
Google is an ad company. Let's be frank. All right, they're an ad company. They're not a device company, and they act like an ad company. I mean, how many people do they have on the Bluetooth stack? All right, I'll stop.
Just speak into the microphone.
Okay, I'll stop. But let me just. What I'm asking is there? So I can't expect Square to carry this burden. Like, who is going to wrapper the mistakes that Google makes and make just something that obeys the basic principles of object-oriented programming of separating model view controller?
WebView. I mean,
actually, that's a really good question on this end. So, like that the original Android was made for really small footprint devices. I mean, they didn't even want you to use interfaces because, it really had to run on a low footprint. But now we've got slightly more powerful devices, and you mentioned WebView. So I'm really curious, how many of you guys are doing hybrid apps right now where you're making use of the power of some of the JavaScript frameworks that's really doing reactive programming and Angular and all these other really great technologies that's in the JavaScript space and bringing them into Android? So you're using WebView?
Yeah, we actually use a lot of HTML5 in our Kindle devices. So a lot of the main features that you'll see, like our Android store and some of the other interfaces, we actually build in HTML5, or at least partially in HTML5.
Anybody else?
We use it for so because we accept payments, there's a lot of user information that we have to extract, which varies country to country. And we have native flows for, I think right now, 3 countries, but we just rolled out to like over 100 countries. And the differences in data that we have to pull is so vast that we didn't want to write some like goofy, in-app templating thing where the forms change. So we just delegate out to WebView, and because that data is being collected and served by the server, it allows us to not only very easily customize it based on what country the user is trying to fill these out for, but it also allows us to very easily change it over time without having to make app releases.
So I see other people nodding. Does that mean you're actually moving in that direction?
We're in the exact same boat since we handle payments in a lot of different countries. We have native payment flows for at least 50% of our 50% of our flows are native, and we're trying to increase, but we have some web views to do for payments just because of the same reason Jake mentioned. It's complicated, and there's a lot of things around the world, and especially not just different places around the world. We have things on our website that require custom forms, and it's a lot easier to just do a web view. We're trying to get that to native, but we still have some web views left on our app, especially on the payments part.
So it looks like we've got another audience question here.
Yes, hi. So I work for a company. We make a lot of apps that are cross-platform with iOS, and we have a great design department, but it seems like on the Android side, for the most part, they only understand iOS. And the Android guidelines and rules are, for the most part, being driven by the developers. And I guess I'm wondering how you guys have dealt with that and how to get our designers to understand Android. Like, it seems like the tool set they're using is purely guided towards iOS, and that's the only thing they understand. And it's really hard to kind of get them up to speed on another platform. Also, I feel like the problem is that they're using iOS devices. Like, have you guys encountered this? Do you have any thoughts?
Force them to use an Android phone.
Yeah, we bought
seriously.
Android phones for our designers.
We did that with some of the folks in our design department. It just forced them to carry an Android phone for an extended period of time. That's the only way they're going to get to understand the interaction model beyond just how screenshots look.
Not a Samsung phone.
Yes.
An Android phone.
And it also comes to you. Like I did that with the designers at our company. I sat down with them. We went to the same apps that they had on the iOS phone. I showed them how the same apps on Android. I explained some of the design patterns. So it has to come from you to take the time, sit down with them, explain it to them. Like when I arrive at Eventbrite, the culture was definitely a lot of like very iOS centric, and I just sat down with people and showed them what Android was, forced them to carry Android phones, and they started doing things on their own. Like now, the designers are the first one that are asking me, "What's the phone that we should get for the design lab?" And I just by spending some time with them to introduce them to Android. Now they're excited. Now they're excited with material design. And like it comes to you, like on Google I/O, they gave me a beautiful book about material design. First thing I did, got to grab a couple copies, take it to my designers. They love it and they get excited about that. So it has to come from you to try to turn that around. And it's because they're not going to do it on their own. So if you take the time to educate them, they'll respond.
Yeah, I want to give a +1 to this right here. It's about building up a relationship with your designers. They're your teammates. You should have alignment. They should be your friends. Get them excited about what you're excited about. If you know more about it, get them coming to you for that information. It's all about that relationship.
And I want a +1 as well, just getting them onto the Android phone. Just tell them, look, you're going to have to use an Android phone for a month. We have a course on Android UI design. In fact, we got our instructor back here, John Hamick, who's architected that course. But one of the first things we do is we just get them using Android, because you'd be surprised how many come in with an iPhone. And they're used to this monolithic app world. And so the whole notion of activities and the idea that an activity can flow from one app completely into another app is foreign. And the whole layout model, the vocabulary, it's foreign. The idea that I've got to build an app that's going to look good on totally different device factors. It's like, what? You mean I can't just say this button always goes in the activity bar? Oh, because the screen might be smaller and there might not be room? These are the things that you've got to be really getting your designers to think about.
The back button.
Oh, the back button, yes. And the fact that the back button is, task-centric, and the idea that a task is not the same thing as an app.
The up button as well.
Absolutely.
And saying all those things doesn't make sense to someone. They have to use it to understand that,
use it.
and then you can reinforce that with how those things work.
I think we'll see a lot of this actually improve with a lot of the additions that were made both to the hardware offering and software offering of iOS 8 and the new iOS devices, where now they are actually being forced to deal with these components that might be coming in from a separate app and appearing in your app, and different screen sizes, resolutions, and densities that they have to design, actually scalable interfaces for. With me, I am an extremely lazy person, and I want to do the minimal amount of effort to get something done. And the fact that, an iOS device traditionally only had a single, if you ignore the density-based scaling, a single resolution and a single hardware device, it makes sense that a designer is only going to design that screen at that resolution at pixel perfect density. So I think hopefully at least that aspect of it, the fact that you'll now start getting stretchable regions, and they'll have to start thinking about interactions with other applications a lot more. The fact that now exists on iOS, both hardware and software, should make it at least a little bit better.
Another audience question.
Yep. So this question is prompted by something that Jake mentioned earlier, but I hope that perhaps it generalizes. So at Square, I understand that you moved from a perhaps multi-activity app to a single activity app, which naively seems like it would be more difficult to work on with a team, more difficult to scale up for people. So I'm curious about that architectural decision and perhaps any other architectural decisions that people may have made that are somewhat analogous for scaling up to team specifics.
Everybody up here is nodding, going, that's a really good question. So
yeah, where to even begin? An activity is just a host to a view. It has a window behind it, and the window has the views. So really all we've done is replace the concept of what an activity represents with something else. For us, it's a presenter and a system that knows how to navigate, but it's really no different fundamentally from the same concept as both activities and fragments. You have a means of encapsulating a view and its presenter or controller, and then you have a means of navigating between them, and the system, the library knows how to make that change. So when you fire an intent, Android knows how to, bring up the new activity and do all the lifecycle steps. It's the same thing for what we have. We have a presenter. The presenter says, I want to view, I want to go to this separate screen. And the underlying library says, I know how to do that. I inflate this. I run the shutdown lifecycle on this guy. I do the startup lifecycle on this guy while I'm playing the animation. So the concepts don't change. And I mean, fragments have the concept almost correct. It's, fundamentally this reusable component. You have your view, you have the business logic behind it, and that is encapsulated as a single reusable thing. And the same with, that's kind of what activities traditionally wanted to be, is these reusable components that you then compose together to create an app. So we're not doing anything fundamentally different. It's just really the actual implementation that's different. Does that answer?
Yeah, it does. So it seems to me then that you've basically replaced this part of the Android framework with your own.
Yes.
And perhaps then that means that Square is the company that's saving Android, as the gentleman suggested earlier.
I mean,
needed being done.
I'm going to cut in here because we're just about out of time. So this is actually fascinating. We should have a whole other session just on the Square architecture here. But just want to wrap up kind of with just SWOT. So where do you guys see the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats in the Android ecosystem and what you're working on? And feel free as well, if you're looking for developers, to pitch that, hey, we're looking for Android developers, and tell us what kind of developers you're looking for, what makes an all-star. And we'll just wrap up with that. We'll start down here. Dave says pick on Larry. So Larry, you're up.
Wow.
You can just pick one of those.
Just pick one of those. I'm excited to see what kind of new security things we're going to see out of the system. We've got a very complicated permissions model that confuses a lot of users and leaves them susceptible to a lot of different issues. And I'm excited to see what's going to happen there and what Google has planned there.
I'm pretty excited about the idea of Android Wear and the integration of your own personal network. We'll see how that goes. I really like the idea of having the one device that controls your own personal network.
I'm excited about, Android Wear and all of the new frontiers of Android on different devices. I'm also excited about Android Silver and taking Android to those feature phones. And that's going to be a challenge for us. Make our apps work on phones that are not as powerful as the phones that we carry. So I'm excited about that. I'm excited of Android permeating into the base of the ecosystem and people that don't carry super powerful phones and be able to offer them a good experience on our apps.
Yeah, I think that's actually one of the interesting things about Android now, is that the growth in the smartphone market is really now in the emerging markets, like in China and India. So there will be a lot more focus on those sort of devices that maybe don't have as much memory or as much CPU power. And I think it's going to be a challenge for developers to actually write apps that perform well under those conditions. It's not about just, oh, here's my Nexus 6 and it runs great, my app runs great on it, So I think that's going to be quite interesting.
It's going to be a game changer and hard for North American developers to really get their head around.
Well, I think there are plenty of phones. I guess you could get an old phone that runs L, runs CM on it, a Cyanogen mod on it, or a lot of the new phones that come out. I was in Safeway the other day and I saw an Android 4.0 phone for $49, like prepaid, and I'm thinking, oh, it's only Android 4.0. I wonder if I can put KitKat on it, but maybe.
So I think so beyond kind of the fundamental UI changes that Lollipop brought on and where that's going, one of the things we didn't really talk about was kind of where the architecture of Android with art and the tooling that goes all the way backwards to the developer is really evolving rapidly. Article just yesterday about emerging compiler, optimizing kind of the tool chain, getting app development, brand new IDE, which just today kind of hit its first release candidate based on the best IDE in the world, and just all the things that really simplify app development. So at Square, we lean very heavily on libraries, and traditionally kind of the tooling around that has been something we've struggled with based on our choices of build system and our choices of IDE. And now that that's really becoming a first-party concern by Google. We're seeing a lot of development in that area, and hopefully simplifying all the pain points around the actual development of the application itself.
Yes, we're hiring. Always.
What are you looking for when you're hiring? You can't just say that. So how does a candidate actually get your attention?
So actually, one of the interesting things in our hiring process is we require a writing sample now, even from developers. If you can't communicate effectively with your team through email, you are likely to create as many problems as you solve. So we require a writing sample, pay attention to it, and do it well. Don't be random, be thoughtful, structure it. The other thing that concerns me is that I don't think a lot of Android developers who are starting to build back-end services for the first time spend enough time really learning how to build scalable back-end services. You know, I remember back when you actually owned your own back-end hardware. You wanted to build something that you could just launch and then it would run forever. Okay, that's not real world. Services fail. Part of your back-end is going to go down. So fail well, fail gracefully, get back up again, transfer load to something that hasn't gone down yet. So learn how backends work to give yourself the best opportunity to scale cleanly and deal with that scale transparently. On a somewhat lighter note, please hold up your watch so that everyone can see. What I want someone to fix is the fact that I can't find an IDE whose layout.xml tools are going to get me around layout. Anyone, please.
Dave.
I think Jake touched on it a little bit, but I think the thing that I'm most excited about it is definitely the new runtime. You know, if you start to look through the code and some of the features about that, where that's headed, there's some really creative and innovative thinking that went into building the Art runtime, and it's going to revolutionize how devices run Android now and in the future. It's going to make things more efficient, both for the apps and the entire system, and it's not something that users are going to see directly, but it affects everything that they see and touch, and it's just going to make the system more amazing for everyone. And yes, Possible is hiring Android engineers all the time, and we have offices all around the world. Possible.com.
So what are you looking for in engineers? For people who are going, yes, I want to be a valuable prospect. What distinguishes somebody who's being hired by your company?
You know, someone who has the skills that we can't teach, because I don't necessarily look for someone who is an expert in Android, because I can teach them the framework. What I can't teach them is how to effectively communicate with other developers, you know, and how to self-start and be a very driven engineer in the workplace. So we look for those soft skills because the coding pieces just about anybody can pick up these days.
So do you guys do the traditional solve this algorithms interview then, or what does your interview look like?
We do a coding test, which is really just a basic way of gauging what your level of familiarity is with the framework. It's not really our way of judging whether or not we're going to hire you, but and we spend less time in the interview talking about computer science type questions, although there are a few of them in there, and more just trying to feel out, again, how well this person can communicate, how well they can think through a problem, than necessarily do you understand how activity works, because really Diane's the only one in the world who does.
Fair enough. So I want to thank everybody for coming and come up and greet us, and thank you everybody in the audience and our streaming audience as well for coming. And it's been a really great Java Users Group or Android meetup. Java Users Group. No. Android meetup. Thank you guys very much.